Hello, this is a teacher summary of Act 4 of The Duchess of Malfi by John Webster. In this presentation, I'll try and go through some of the main points that you should consider in your comparisons and contrasts with The Merchant's Tale. Okay. Act 4 is unusual in this play in that in Shakespeare's plays, often Act 4 is a quiet act of reconciliation, perhaps the growth of self-knowledge, and activity is lessened. There's less sort of dramatic moments leading to the climax of Act 5. But here we've got in Act 4 the sort of the despair of the Duchess, the growing madness of Ferdinand, and ultimately the death of the protagonist of the Duchess in Act 4, which is unusual. Okay, so the bulk of scene 1 shows the Duchess being tortured psychologically by Ferdinand, who wants to bring her to madness. And as a result, her spirit's broken, she's brought to despair. And that's something that we're going to talk about, on how a Jacobean audience would respond to despair. In this act as well, it's kind of interesting that the attempts by Ferdinand to bring the Duchess to madness kind of reflects his own growing insanity in this act, and it also has the unexpected consequence of making Basola repent and feel remorseful for his actions. Okay, let's consider first of all the theatrical context. Shakespeare's plays were mainly performed in the Globe, an open-air theatre which was open to all strata, all classes of society, down to the groundlings who would pay a penny to enter and were quite rowdy. Whereas John Webster's play is performed inside, in the Blackfriars Theatre, not the Globe. The audience would have been a much more affluent, wealthy audience. To afford the tickets, there would be minimal space. They might be the audience of the court, the powerful. Because this play is performed indoors, particularly in Act 4, it kind of relies on lighting and the suspension of disbelief caused by sort of minimal lighting. And it adds probably the candlelight as well adds to this growing sense of darkness taking over the world of the play and taking over the characters, particularly Ferdinand. Acting in darkness always also suits the character of Basola. And so we've got a number of events in this act which we have to believe that the Duchess is seeing the corpses of her dead children and husband, but they're merely wax effigies. And so the minimal lighting adds to that dramatic effect. We've also got the parade, the mask of the insane inhabitants of the mental institution. And again, the candlelight lighting adds to the macabre effect of that. In the Duchess's suffering caused by her Ferdinand and his deranged actions, Basola starts to become very impressed with the way she handles herself. He describes her as nobly she handles herself, more perfect in her tears than in her smiles. So to the audience, she's now taking on one of the main characteristics of a tragic hero or heroine, that they face their own demise with fortitude and bravery. But in this, Basola seems to be showing some form of repentance himself, all comfort to your grace. So the despair of the Duchess perhaps triggers the repentance of Basola. And let's consider the subject of despair. Despair actually means loss of hope and faith in God. And to a Jacobean audience, this would be seen as a mortal sin. A mortal sin is a sin in which the person would go straight to hell. So ideas of despair and suicide would, to a Jacobean audience, be seen as the mortal soul being in danger. And I suppose that religious context should be borne in mind when thinking about how Basola seems to be seeing the Duchess in a new way, and also how he begins to see himself in a new way as well. So despair, wishing to rid oneself of one's own life, not wanting to live anymore, is seen as an act of a religious transgression. The Duchess doesn't want to stay on Earth one minute more, and it's Basola here who reminds her of her Christianity. Fine, despair, remember you are a Christian. Okay, Basola now, rather than trying to entrap her, is now seen as the guardian of her soul in some way. So there's been a transformation in the characters. One last thing, many of Shakespeare's plays also deal with this subject. You know, the greatest torture souls feel in hell, says the Duchess. Christopher Marlowe's play, Dr. Faustus, deals with this idea of what happens to the soul when it goes to hell. What is hell? Dr. Faustus says to Mephistopheles, where is hell? And Mephistopheles says, the absence of heaven is hell. So hell is all around us. And this subject preoccupies the Jacobean and Elizabethan audience. We see it also in Hamlet, the most famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether we should suffer all the ills of life or end it, but what happens after the end? Claudio in Measure for Measure, when he's sentenced to death for having unlawful sex with his girlfriend, fears, the one thing he fears is the idea of hell, a place of ice, of howling. So it's a place of sensory punishment, and it's a real place. And so to a Jacobean audience, the idea of despair and one soul going to hell is a real present danger. And that should be noted in the exchanges between the Duchess and Basola. Okay, so let's consider the new role of Basola. Rather than intelligentsia and malcontent, he's become spiritual counselor to the Duchess. Fie on despair, you are a Christian. Leave this vain sorrow. Things begin at the worst, begin to mend. You know, things can only get better. Basola really seems to be genuine in his pity for the Duchess, and he turns his anger on Ferdinand. Why do you do this? And Ferdinand says to bring her to despair. So this is a deliberate act on Ferdinand's part. But what's interesting here, and perhaps raises the question of Basola being perhaps the tragic hero of this play, is that he has a change of heart. He decides, never in my own shape will I visit her again, other than to be the business of comfort. I shall never, and this last cruel line, I shall do nothing but bring comfort from now on. So he pleads with Ferdinand to send her to a convent to save her life and just lead her life in peace. And in many ways, Act 4 is about the transformation of Basola as much as the demise of the Duchess. Okay, Act 4, Scene 2. A lot happens in this scene. We have the growing insanity of Ferdinand. So look at his language and how cruel and maniacal it becomes. The Duchess is continued to be tortured, and Basola goes in disguise to gauge how she is in her suffering. We have the death of her two children and Cariola, and we'll look at that a little bit closely. And we have the growing madness of Ferdinand. And the scene ends with Basola taking the Duchess's body away for a proper burial to be given to good women. Okay, if we remember how the Basola has talked to the old lady and has talked to characters before, we do see that in some sense that there is a transformation in this character in this scene. So we'll look at these acts, these short incidences in a little detail. Okay, let's consider what is typical of a tragic hero in Act 4, and in some ways Duchess meets these conventions. A tragic hero in Act 4/5 must show heroism in the way they face their death. Okay, and so you get lots of references to fate, fortune, and this is typical of tragedies, and how there's a kind of fortitude in the way that the protagonist faces their inevitable death. And one of the things that a tragic hero must attain by the end of the play is a sense of self-knowledge, and perhaps best summed up by the line, I am Duchess of Malfi still. So even in her madness and in her despair, she recognises who she is. In the same way that Macbeth does in Act 5, this idea that he goes out as a soldier fighting he returns to what he was before he was tempted by the witches. And what we should see in Act 4 particularly, and also in Act 5, is the way that Duchess is described, particularly in terms of heavenly imagery. Now, what that suggests is that, okay, she might die in this world, but she will achieve divine justice in the next. And in some ways, tragedies are inherently moral. While immoral acts happen in the world of the play, there is a sense that there's a moral framework or a sort of spiritual divine framework that rewards the virtuous and punishes the evildoers, as George Bush would say, in the afterlife. So look at how the language used to describe the Duchess by both Basola and her brother and Cariola and various other characters is explicitly Christian, suggesting that she's going to enter the afterlife. By that I mean heaven. Okay, so Act 4 Scene 2, we've got the anti-mask, if you like. Ferdinand prepares a kind of anti-mask, a sort of weird, perverted, corrupt dance of various madmen outside the bedroom chamber of the Duchess, outside her prison cell, if you like, in order to increase her despair. And if you think about your work that you've done on The Tempest, and how Prospero conjures up a mask as a form of celebration for the marriage of Ferdinand and Miranda, a mask, a form of celebration symbolizing unity and restoration of order. In many ways, this is like a dance macabre, a celebration of death and madness. And in a way, it reminds the audience of the perverse and turbulent nature of Ferdinand as much as anything else. And dance macabre is, in many ways a celebration of madness. And, to the Jacobean and well up into the Victorian times, people often got entertainment from watching the behaviours of mad people. They would go and pay a penny to go into a mental institution in Victorian times, just to watch and laugh at mental illness. And so here it's used as a form of entertainment. But it's not just used as a form of entertainment. The anti-mask is used as a form of punishment, of torture for the Duchess, but also it's a form of satire as well. There's a kind of social commentary made by the people involved in the parade. These madmen include lawyers and priests, tailors and farmers, and brokers, like financial brokers. And the idea is that the implication is that these characters are in many ways corrupted, and that this is kind of a social criticism of these particular occupations in this mask. And so Webster is using this as a form of social satire, and maybe you could compare that with how Chaucer satirizes merchants, satirizes old arrogant men, satirizes different parts of society in the Canterbury Tales. So what we have in this anti-mask is, rather than harmony, unity and order being restored, as usually happens in later acts of plays, here is an example of perverse and turbulent nature of society. Okay, so as we get to the end of the Duchess, I think one of the themes which is common in tragedies is that theme of appearance versus reality is explored, and particularly the religious hypocrisy of the powerful. Basola in this speech is perhaps commenting on those in power. They don't have their eyes fixed upon the stars because their minds are bent wholly on the world. They're worldly rather than spiritual. And maybe he's making a comment about how perhaps Ferdinand and his brother the Cardinal are religiously hypocritical. And that's something you could say also about January. Characters who use religion for their own hypocritical ends. And this quote from the Duchess just before she dies is important. She says, "Yet stay, heaven gates are not so highly arched as princes' palaces." She's making a social comment about the arrogance and pride of powerful princes. To enter heaven, only the humble man may pass. Only the penitent man may pass. Must go on his knees. And this is we see this in Indiana Jones. Only the penitent man will pass. So she's making a comment about the arrogance and pride of the powerful. And I suppose we should remember that who's watching this play but the perhaps potentially arrogant and proud elites of the courts of London. And so maybe there's a kind of subversive social criticism being made at the audience as well. So in her final act, before her death, we see the tragic hero status of the Duchess showing heroism. She doesn't care in what way she will be killed, be it by pearls, cassia, should she be shot to death with pearls or diamonds, it doesn't really matter. And she gives us a quote here, which I believe is from Seneca, and you might remember your Seneca in the Octorites, the references in Chaucer by the merchant. On marriage, and she says, death has many thousand doors and they go in strange ways, but you may open them both ways anyway for heaven's sake. She's prepared for death, and she's shown fortitude, and her status is that of a tragic hero at this end of the play. And she asks not to, "I'll not be tedious with you, my last woman's fault." She sees that being tedious or delaying things is a woman's fault. She says, "Do it." And so pull and pull strongly. So she makes reference, "Bring heaven down, bring heaven's gates, bring heaven upon me." So the audience are left in no doubt that she's not dying in despair, but that she's going to heaven. And then she makes that comment again about how heaven is not a place for proud princes. So she's defining herself in ways in which she's not like her two brothers. So Act 4 and Act 5s of tragedies are will often reveal in protagonists and antagonists moments of glimpses of self-awareness. Tragedies are often about loss of identity and then identity regained in Acts 4/5. And we see maybe examples of that with Ferdinand. Okay, this man of perverse and turbulent nature, immediately on the death of his sister, begins to blame Basola for his actions. Basola says, "Do you not weep? You have approved this thing." And again, Ferdinand says, "Well, why didst thou not pity her? Why not send her to some sanctuary?" Which was the very thing Basola asked him to do before she was killed. So it's unusual that Ferdinand blames Basola for the very thing he asked Basola to do. But I think in some ways he kind of comes out of his madness here as well. The death of the Duchess brings him out briefly out of his madness. He says, "I bade thee do those things when I was distracted of my wits." So he's kind of showing some sense of self-awareness here of his own madness, and now deeply regrets what he's done. And so maybe in this regret is where we're seeing him being punished for his actions. Okay, he's being stung by his own poison, if you like. And he kind of reveals why he did it. He says, "Only I must confess I had a hope, had she continued widowed, to have gained an infinite mass of treasure by her death, and that was the main cause, her marriage, that drew a stream of gall quite through my heart." So in a sense, we're getting this kind of confession from Ferdinand about why he did all of this. It was for her treasure, or that's what he's saying. And he says that sent anger, a stream of gall, quite through his heart. So in some ways, characters showing a degree of self-knowledge, we can include Ferdinand in this at the end of the play, as well as Basola. And perhaps the Duchess. She realizes her goodness and that she's going to heaven, and she doesn't despair any longer. Okay, the last exchange between Basola and Ferdinand is quite interesting in many ways. Basola is making a judgment not just on the Cardinal and Ferdinand, but also on himself here. He says the office of justice is perverted quite when one thief hangs another. He's admitting, or he's acknowledging his own sin as much as commenting on the sins of the brothers. Your brother and yourself are worthy men. You're a pair of hearts as are hollow graves, rotten and rotting others, and your vengeance, like two-chained bullets, still goes arm in arm. So he's making judgments on them as like corrupt. Again, notice all the language to do with disease and plague. I think that's because revenge kind of infects up people and leads to more revenge. It's kind of infectious, and certainly the language around Ferdinand is always around disease because he's kind of going mad. But Basola has it as well. He sees everything like a plague. But again, I think Basola's having a confession here as well. He says, I stand like one that hath taken a sweet and golden dream. I am angry with myself now that I awake. So we can start to see maybe if tragic heroes have to go through a turning point and gain self-knowledge, we're starting to see perhaps that Basola might be the tragic hero of the play as well. I'm angry with myself now that I am awake. He's angry that he appeared a true servant rather than an honest man to Ferdinand. And his language also, in the same way that the Duchess's language references heaven, Basola's language seems to reference hell quite a lot. So we seem to sweat in ice and freeze in fire. Ice and fire were commonly seen as kind of the domains of hell, particularly ice in this age, and then later on it's seen as a place of fire. What would I do if I was to do this again? And this is what he says, I would not change my peace of conscience for all the wealth of the world. So this malcontent, this outsider who's going to play by his own rules, has now decided that he would rather have his conscience than have all the wealth of Europe. And at this moment of self-confession, of genuine self-confession, because he thinks he's talking to himself, the Duchess comes back to life briefly. And I suppose that's why strangulation is one of the most common forms of death in tragedies, because it allows for that dramatic last words for the audience. And interestingly, her last word is Antonio. But what Basola sees in the Duchess coming back to life is his own redemption, his own Christian redemption, when he says this, return fair soul from darkness and lead mine out of that dissensible hell. She's warm, she breathes. Upon these pale lips I will melt my heart. Again, the idea is that she will bring salvation. And he says, open up her eyes open, and heaven in it seems to open. Is heaven opening for him? That late was shut to take me up to mercy. So he sees in the Duchess his own redemption. He sees his chance for heaven, but she only says Antonio. And interestingly, in this play in which the truthful lie and the liars tell the truth, Basola is one of the liars telling the truth here. Or he's now telling the truth but lying in order to ease her suffering. Yes, madam, he is living. The dead bodies you saw were but feigned statues. He's reconciled to your brother, the Pope, hath wrought the statement. So he ends by giving her a lie that everything is fine and that everyone is alive, which isn't the truth. And it's interesting that the Duchess says mercy at the end. So he gives a noble lie as much to sort of ease her journey into the next life. which in some ways is perhaps quite a Christian sympathetic thing to do. But again, in this play in which truth and lies go hand in hand, it's kind of interesting ending. So she says mercy at the end. Again, she's explicitly seen in Christian terms and going to heaven. But is she giving mercy to Basola? The audience have to decide on that. And Basola has to decide himself as well. Does she open up heaven for Basola, or is it too late for him? Well, let's consider if we can see Basola as perhaps a tragic hero of the play. The qualities of a tragic hero are they're admired, they have noble qualities. Maybe he's not of high status, but their language is of noble, is noble. They lack self-knowledge, and perhaps they regain it. Their suffering is greater than the suffering they cause others. They're not entirely to blame for their demise. Well, is Basola entirely to blame for his demise? Or is the fact he's an outsider out of his control and he's merely been acting in a corrupt world? But Webster seems to give Basola some of the conventions of a tragic hero. We end Act 4 on a soliloquy by Basola. Again, spoken in verse, soliloquies are usually they usually do one of four things. They make a commentary on the world. They show someone's plan or intention. They're a moment of self-knowledge, and they are questioning or see the world in a new way. Is this a moment of self-knowledge, self-awareness? Well, let's have a look at it. What does he say? He comments on a guilty conscience. Is he commenting on his own conscience? The Duchess has just died. He's alone on the stage. And whilst a guilty conscience is a black register wherein is writ all our good deeds and bad. So he says that's what we have. Our conscience is a register of our good deeds and our bad deeds. He acknowledges his own tears here, but he questions his own tears. This is manly sorrow, and I'm very certain never grew in my mother's milk. Okay, these penitent fountains, did they flow when she was living? So he's questioning his own emotions here. He's crying, but he's questioning whether he's actually truthful or not, or is he being hypocritical? But he's talking to himself, and so perhaps the audience feel that there's some sincerity in him. And rather like the Duchess talks in terms of heavenly language, he's talking in terms of hell. Here is a sight as direful to my soul as is the sword unto a wretch have slain his father. Again, he sees the death of the Duchess as in some way the death of his own soul. But he decides to do some good. Like he said in the last scene, my actions from now on will only be to bring comfort. He says, I'll bear thee hence and execute thy last will. So he decides he's gonna see out the Duchess's last words, which were to dispose of her body to some good women. Again, which is an interesting quote in terms of how characters see women in the play. Some good women, even this most misogynistic of characters early in the play, acknowledges that there's good women out there. The cruel tyrant shall not deny me. And I'll post to Milan where somewhat I will speedily enact, worth my dejection. So he exits with the Duchess's body on stage to give her body over to some women. So merely this action in itself is showing a turning point in Basola. His language is in many ways acknowledging his own guilty conscience. He has tears, they must be sincere, but even in his sincerity, he's questioning that sincerity. Why didn't I cry when she was alive? So he's being punished by his own conscience. So Act 4 ends with Ferdinand and Basola being punished for their actions with their own conscience. In many ways, the play is becoming a moral framework in which, even though the Duchess has died, we get the sense that she is surviving in a spiritual heavenly afterworld, and that the other characters will be punished in the afterworld for their actions.